So before I introduce Zach, our speaker, who has come here from Vienna, I wanted to say a couple words about the series in which he's speaking. Taky musím říct, že bohužel pro ty, kteří studují češtinu, tentokrát akce se proběhne anglicky, budeme teda střídat, některé akce budou v češtině, některé v angličtině podle toho, jak raději mluví přednášející a debatující. Takže teď přejdu zpět na angličtinu, ale kdyby byl jakýkoliv problém na konci, třeba když chcete položit otázku česky, klidně položte česky, my to přeložíme v angličtině. I was just explaining, we have some of these events in this lecture and discussion series will be in Czech, some in English, as circumstances demand. So we will make do with that, and anyone who wants to ask a question at the end in Czech, so be prepared. You can have a question in Czech, you can answer in Polish, or we'll translate it into English. If you want to ask a question in Polish, also feel free. Yiddish also permitted. Okay, so this is the second in the series of lectures that we've titled in Czech Jiná židovství, in English Jewishness Otherwise. Just a couple words about that. First, why Jewishness? This is a term we're using, one might call it a free translation of the Yiddish term Yiddishkeit. This is, we're trying to, we've chosen this term to avoid the connotations of Judaism that sounds like a religion, Jewish identity that sounds like a fixed identity. Jewishness, we want to look at in this series as a legacy, a certain tradition that people can look back on, people can draw from it what they want, they can reinterpret it, an open tradition that invites people to come to it and debate what it has been, what it should be. And that means not only saying this is what Jewishness has always been, always will be, but saying this is what it has been at some moment and from a certain perspective, opening up questions of what we can take from Jewish tradition today, looking forward. And now we come to the otherwise part, Jiná židovství. We know everyone comes into Jewishness with certain ideas about what that might mean. Someone might imagine orthodoxy rules, someone might imagine the state of Israel, someone might imagine Jewish communists, someone might imagine klezmer. Jewishness may be all that and all that a little bit differently than we imagine or we understand a priori. So this discussion series, in each moment we're dealing with a different interpretation, a different tradition as to what Jewishness has been that tries to push against some of the received ideas, not necessarily looking completely in the most obscure places. For example, our first debate was between Pavel Pasha and Vít Škrobák, who's in the back, about left Zionism and to what extent can that still be considered, or was it historically an emancipatory and universalist tradition alongside its particularist national claims? So certainly Zionism is part of this kind of constellation of Jewish legacies. The Bund is another one. It's not an obscure tradition at all, but one that maybe for too long have been downplayed. And so I'm really excited to have Zach Smerin here to talk about the Bundist tradition. And so I won't say much more about that. I'll let him tell us what it has been and why some people increasingly think that the Bund is still a relevant tradition for us today. So now, Zach Smerin, I think, personally I find he's been involved in some of the most interesting Jewish organizing projects in recent times, especially in the Jewish socialist movement, also Jewish cultural movements, and he's a co-founder of Cafe Bund in Krakow. He is co-founder of the Jewish Diasporist podcast, which I recommend searching for and listening to. And he's still on the National Committee of the Jewish Socialist Group of Great Britain, and may soon be on the Provisional Steering Committee, but we'll see.
We'll get to that.
Of the revived International Labour Bund. So he'll talk for a bit and then prepare questions for the end. Thanks, Zach.
Thank you very much. Is the microphone loud enough? Should it be adjusted somewhat? Speaking okay? Yeah. Thanks. Thank you so much, Joe, for the introduction. Ahoy. It's good to be back in Prague. I was here last time, almost right at the end between December and January 2024. It is a little bit weak, isn't it? Is it possible to just maybe have it a little bit stronger?
I think.
Yeah, so just a little bit about myself. Thank you so much for the introduction, the opportunity to speak here. I'm a history student, or have been a history student, 5 years of studies in England. Involved there in quite a bit of campus organizing, primarily in Jewish lab spaces and within mainstream communal spaces. Yeah. And also, as mentioned, we have a podcast co-hosted with Ben Janowitz, who's in California, which always makes scheduling difficult because there's an 8-hour difference. And we had Joe on about the Declaration of Independence of Diaspora a few months ago, which was very, very interesting. So when it comes to like history writing and podcasts, I'm used to having 2 monitors in front of me, so that's also why I'm doing it in this form. So yeah, the part that you see over here, I have to confess, I'm engaging in a little bit of self-plagiarism because I gave a talk a few weeks ago, basically on a similar subject in Krakow for Cafe Bund in Polish, and so you can see the original art from a few weeks ago, but expanded on it, made the presentation a bit nicer, adapted what worked, what didn't, and also very happy for it to be recorded. Generally speaking, I'm going to be working on 3 parts. Maybe I should ask before, like, who here has heard about the Bund or a little bit more? If you'd like to raise your hand. Okay, that's pretty good. So I'll subdivide it just into 3 parts, and if someone's I do understand that when it comes to English, English native speakers shouldn't take it for granted that everybody's like understanding everything. So if I'm speaking too quickly or not pronouncing, then please let me know. So yeah, when it comes to when it comes to what I want to talk about today, just subdivide it into sort of 3 main parts. One is just sort of going through what the Bund was historically. Just there isn't that much possibility for people to have like a general, concise history of the Bund. Usually it's very surface level, or it's so academic that it gets, well, it's academic and it gets too specific. There still isn't easily accessible general history of the Bund in English. There's one in French, but it's not being translated. Then I'll talk a little bit about why this is relevant, why this isn't just a historical curiosity, and in the last part, just some of the attempts of what people who describe themselves as Bundists, who want to organize as Bundists, are doing today. When it comes to the history of the Bund, there's a little bit of discussion of what eras are, and none of these should be taken as too strict, but at some points it's interesting to mention what may be considered like, you know, when the Bund acted in a different way, what were the conditions of its organizing and such. So let's get into it. So in the 19th century, if we're talking about Eastern Europe primarily, and the Russian Empire in particular, but also some other areas, most Jews were still not fully emancipated. In Russia, they existed in the Pale Settlement, So they were very strict in terms of where they could live. They were discriminated against in terms of what employment they could have, certainly in government positions or in the newly industrialized factories. This is also a time where industrial capitalism is growing more and more, and modern ideas of nationalism are developing. Jews are also primarily living in urban areas, and there's also a significant amount of emigration that comes from Eastern Europe. This is also a time when there are more and more pogroms that are associated with the assassination of the Tsar and in the 1880s. And generally speaking, there are different ways in which Jews and Jewish political movements try to respond to this situation. The Russian Empire is by far the largest, has by far the largest population, Jewish population in the world of any country at this point. So yeah, in terms of how do Jews and Jewish political movements try and solve what is described as the Jewish question, there are these. So I think that you can say there are four main currents, but you shouldn't treat them as like strict positions. They're like intersections between them too. A lot of people move in between them. And there are other ones as well. I won't discuss, for example, folkism, which is a very interesting tradition of its own by historian Simon Dudenhoff, which is basically like a non-socialist diasporism. But starting from the most traditional, Orthodox Jewish political movements, there are of course divisions within Orthodox Judaism as understood. The Hasidic movement is still relatively new at this time, but it's the way in which they respond to the outside world is primarily to keep it the same, maintain tradition, avoid the outside world and influences from the outside world as much as possible, and if there are any sorts of interactions, then do it by connection with the supreme governor, whether it be the emperor or the king. And of course, a lot of Jews are influenced by the new ideas of the Enlightenment and emancipation as it's imagined in Western Europe, and the way in which Jewish communities are in Western Europe are responding to it. And so there are assimilationist and reform movements in Judaism, primarily in places like Germany and France, that identify Jewishness as primarily being a religious identity. They reject the idea of Jews being a national people, certainly not a national global people. However, this becomes more and more challenging by the end of the 19th century because anti-Semitism moves away from the traditional sort of Christian forms of Jew hatred based on religious ideas, although they still remain quite prevalent, but it becomes more and more of a racial concept, one that conversion that can't help with. And so there are, for example, we have the Dreyfus Affair in 1896, where a fully assimilated Jewish officer in the French army gets accused of spying for Germany. And there's this big debate between people who think he's a spy. In the end, he gets cleared, but not before he gets deported. And in the Austro-Hungarian Empire, there is more and more of a Christian social movement and pan-German movements competing anti-Semitic movements. And Vienna becomes the first large city in the Western world that has an open anti-Semitic agitator as mayor, Karl Lueger, who also influences to a significant extent Adolf Hitler, who at that time didn't know. And both of these things, the Dreyfus Affair and the election of Karl Lueger, they have a significant effect on a rather assimilationist Viennese Jewish journalist who reports on the Dreyfus Affair from Paris, Theodor Herzl, who becomes one of the main thinkers of political Zionism, though of course he isn't the only one. For him there are people like Ha'am, Shovei Zion, and also forms of territorialism, so the establishment of Jewish colonies or Jewish residential settlements in places like Argentina. There's of course the floating of the Ugandan scheme as well, and of course the idea of returning to the ancestral land of the Jews in Eretz Yisrael. And then of course there's the development of all the various socialist ideas. socialism becomes more and more associated with Marxism and Marxist political thought, although that's not the only, by any means, that exists neither in Russia or in Europe. But there is a significant Jewish influence in or presence in the socialist movement of various kinds. I sort of cut through different perspectives here because, like Marx, who came from a Jewish family, there are Jewish thinkers who primarily abandon their Jewish identity while being involved in the socialist movement. That doesn't stop people, of course, calling them Jews as such. There are socialist Zionists that believe that Jews in socialism can only truly exist in freedom and liberation within the confines of their own territory or state. There are some religious socialists as well. One of the earliest Jewish socialist thinkers who you can kind of track both Zionism and Buddhism as as one of their founding thinkers is Aaron Lieberman, who comes from the yeshiva in Vilna. And likewise, one of the founders of the Bund, Arkady Kremen, also comes from a Vilna yeshiva. And there are other thinkers as well, not even necessarily socialists, but ones that try and adapt Jewish religious values towards socialism. Rabbi Yosef Bloch is a very interesting example of that in Vienna, but he's not the only one. And then there's what I would think is best described as Jewish. I just realized I didn't translate this slide in Polish, so apologies about that. But Jewish autonomous diasporist socialism. Now, what do all of these things mean? Socialism, in the case of the Bund, is very strongly connected toward Marxist political thought. Diasporist means, in this context, although the Bund would not use that word itself, towards the presence of Jews in diaspora as basically the case of it being right now. I'm not trying to imagine a situation where that might not be the case, but just Jews live in diaspora now. And autonomous means that they get to organize as Jews. They're not just Jews being part of a movement, they're Jews who organize as Jews and part of the Jewish movement. So what you can see over here, if you speak Czech, then you might be able to understand some of what's written about here. Some of the earliest parts of the Jewish Labour movement in the 1870s onwards are sick relief organizations, basically worker insurance, unions, secret literary classes that meet. In 1895, Julius Martov, who becomes one of the very important leaders of Russian socialists, who is Jewish, but becomes later on very assimilated. But it's in a rather ironic twist. He gives a speech on May Day 1895 in Vilna, which basically calls for a socialist organization that will speak to Jews in their language and as Jews in Yiddish, not just as Russian. It's called Obagitatsy in Russian, and recently I just found out that it's been translated into English, which previously was considered not to exist. And then in 1897, 2 years later, out of all of these movements, the insurance funds, the union, the literary circles, there are 13 delegates that meet in a house in Vilna. They meet during Yom Kippur because a lot of Jews travel during Yom Kippur to be with their families, and so they're able to meet in an attic in Vilna, and they established the Allgemeine Jiddische Arbeiterbund in Polen und Russland. So the General Jewish Labour Bund, Bund being association in Russia and Poland. The Lithuania gets added to the name a bit later, and it comes from the General German Labour Bund, which was the organization that later on, after many changes, became the modern SPD, but that's where they get the name from. And it happens because the next year, you actually have the establishment of the Russian Social Democratic Labour Party, which would later be both the roots of the Bolsheviks and the Mensheviks. And the Bund, as a start, gets 3 out of the 9 seats in the Central Committee, which is disproportionately large to the Jewish population, but as you will see, the strength of the Bund was itself quite strict. I will also mention, if we're talking about Jewish socialist autonomous diasporism, again, to make the point, if you want to, that Jewish socialists have organized everywhere in the world. The Minister of Health in one of Mao Zedong's governments in the 1930s was a Viennese Jew. There were Jews fighting, there were Ethiopian Jews, Jewish socialists fighting against the Italians. There were Jewish socialists fighting with Che Guevara in Bolivia, in Cuba. There were Jewish communists that had some important activities in the communist parties of Morocco and Egypt and Iraq. But if we're talking about, again, Jews organizing as Jews within the socialist movement, then the Bund is the primary example, though not the only one, and the one that I want to particularly mention here is the Social Democratic Federation of Salonika, which organized Sephardic Jewish workers in Greece. And its founder was Abraham Ben-Aroya, a very important character that definitely deserves to be known. In some ways, the Social Democratic Federation was actually more successful than the Bund in some ways. I can speak about that more if you are interested. So over the next few years, there is, as with every organization, you know, people are interested in setting it up at first, and then like a lot of the other stuff gets actually like sorted out. There's a lot of questions that need to be answered. That's normal with every organization. And so the first few years are really this sort of this idea, like there are a lot of debates and discussions. Of course, throughout this whole time, it's not aided by the persecution by the Russian government of any opposition movements to it. But generally speaking, you start coming up with some of the ideas of national cultural autonomy being the slogan of the Bund, in terms of how to identify, how to have Jewish self-determination in the diaspora that reflects both the struggles that Jews have as Jews and as workers. And this is borrowed or taken from the Social Democrats in the Austro-Hungarian Empire. In fact, I believe that it was in the Austro-Hungarian Social Democrats adopt that position of national cultural autonomy from the 1897 Congress in Brno. So there's a Czech aspect to that as well. The difference is, in terms of how this is understood, is that national cultural autonomy can be both considered in a territorial manner and a non-territorial manner. So you can have, so in the case of the Austro-Hungarian Empire, for example, there are clear places where, for example, Czechs were the majority, or Croats were the majority, or Italians were the majority. And so the question of autonomy there is basically can be described as this is where you are, this is where your territory is, where you have minority rights. The question with the Jews in Austro-Hungarian Empire and most other places is that there aren't territories in which Jews constitute a majority, except for some shtetls, for example. But you can't speak of like an autonomous Jewish territory in the same sense that you can speak about, for example, the Poles. And so this is the real innovation, that on one hand it's the case of the Bund speaking of the innovation of non-territorial autonomy, and this is usually done through, it becomes articulated by one of Bund's thinkers in the sense of Jews can have their own assembly that either gets to collect taxes on its own or it gets a donation from the government. What's also interesting is that the Bund considers this completely voluntary. It basically says that if Jews do not want to be part of this assembly, they don't have to, and also does not set any sort of requirements of who is a Jew or like who is truly Jewish to be able to join the assembly. In 1903, there is a Congress of the Russian Social Democrats in London, and that's where you have the Bolshevik-Menshevik split that you might have heard of between Lenin and Martov on the other side. What's interesting is that Bolshevik and Menshevik being majority and minority within the party, the reason as to why Lenin gets to call his faction the majority faction is because a few days earlier in the Congress, the Bund withdraws from the Russian Social Democrats. The Bund tries to argue that it should be recognized as the Jewish representation in the labor movement, and a lot of even assimilated Jews in the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks, like Martov or Trotsky, for example, do refuse to accept that position, and the Bundists get accused of nationalism, and so they withdraw for several years. At this time, you also see an increase in anti-Semitism. So you have a very important date, it's the pogrom in Kishinev in Moldova in 1903, and the Bund starts being more and more active in terms of physical self-defense of the Jewish community. Here you can see on the top right, this is not Lenin, this is Sir Patrick Stewart from Star Trek, for example. He plays Lenin in an old TV series in the 70s. And it shows exactly the moment in which the Bund leaves the Russian Social Democrats at that Congress. It's one of the few moments that of the history of the Bund that's been reproduced as in a piece of TV or cinema. The interesting point here as well about the crystallization of the movement is that there are constant discussions about how to react to the oppression that the working class and socialists and Jews get from the Russian dictatorial state. They're haunted by the secret police, the military, the police itself, and so there's a wing of the Russian revolutionaries, the Social Revolutionary Party, which is a non-Marxist socialist party that advocates for militant revenge. They call for assassination of public officials, heads of secret police and chief, and there's a real debate that engages in situations, for example, where workers' strikes are brutally repressed and workers are killed, whether or not there should be acts of revenge done. And at this time, this policy, both within the socialist and anarchist movements, is called terrorism. It's describing very strictly assassination of elected officials. In one of its congresses, the Bund supports this position, and then a year later it reversed itself. Generally, Social Democrats and socialists were opposed to it because they thought it brings more consequences on the movement, and also because it's not a systemic addressing of the issue. Just because you assassinate one police chief doesn't change the situation. In fact, it might make it a lot worse. And of course, at this time, there are of course a lot of strikes that take place. Here are some of the early thinkers of the Bund. On the left is Vladimir Meden, who comes from he officially converted to Christianity when he was a child. He came from a very assimilated Jewish family in Russia, and then as a student, he embraces political. He becomes a political radical at the University of Kiev, and he begins to associate more and more with Jewish socialists, and becomes one of the leading theoreticians of the Bund. His memoirs are publicly available and translated to English. I highly recommend them. In the middle, you have a very important power couple of the Bund. One of the founders, or two of the founders, Arkady Kremer, one of the 13 delegates in 1897, who's the one who came from the Vilna yeshiva. That's going to be important later. And his wife Patty, they live as emigres in Switzerland and then in London. They're very active in trying to help out the Bund in exile. Patty will die in 1943. Kremer dies a few years before World War II starts. Patty Kremer dies during the Holocaust in Vilna in 1943. Esther Frumkin is one of the leaders of the Bund. Some historians even think that she could have been considered the leader had she not been a woman. She ends up actually getting rewritten from a lot of later Bundist history because after the Russian Revolution in 1917, she joins the communists, and we'll get back to this as well. She gets cast out of the history of the movement. In 1904, Russia and Japan go to war. And generally speaking, there's a lot of confidence that Russia is going to win because they're fighting against a non-European power, and they lose. They lose very badly the east. And this is a spark towards discontent and revolution, the first Russian Revolution. And this is also the time when the Bund is at its highest point within as an underground organization in Russia. It has, depending on the estimates, it has tens of thousands, around 35,000 members or active organizers. While the Bolsheviks and Mensheviks combined have a few thousand, despite, of course, Jews being a much less proportional part of the Russian Empire. The revolution doesn't succeed. There is a very severe reaction, and by 1907, 1908, out of that high of tens of thousands of members, the Bund ends up remaining with only 700. So the actual existence of the movement is at risk. They're hit very hard. During this time, you also see more and more development of relationships with Polish parties, because specifically Polish socialists are faced with a dilemma of or a debate of whether they should be both whether they should prioritize the fight for independence or the fight for socialism. And so there are the Polish Socialist Party, the PPS, split in 1906, and then there's also the Social Democrats of the Polish Kingdom and Lithuania. That's one of the leaders of that is Rosa Luxemburg. The Bund gets back after the counter-revolution, gets closer to the Mensheviks, who begin to warm more. The people like Martov were generally very anti-Jewish separatist in their socialism around 1903. After a few years, they begin to warm to the idea, and they get closer. And then also in this time, in 1905, you have the establishment of the Jewish Social Democratic Party of Galicia, which is in the Austrian partition of Poland. It's in Galicia, so places like Krakow and Lvov. And you see this is also one of the very early defining periods of the Bund, in which they do not pursue a universalist perspective of Jewish socialism. They're very much rooted in their connection to the conditions of Eastern Europe, and in particular the Russian Empire. And there are going to be important consequences of that as well. But you do have basically a Bundist organization that develops in Galicia, and even has a little bit of a presence in Vienna. The Bund begins to be. There are parliamentary elections in Russia after 1905, but they're generally very repressed. Nevertheless, the Bund combines with the Polish left to elect a Polish socialist member of parliament from Warsaw, at the cost of the Polish nationalists, who are very upset about this, and you can see more and more anger towards the Bund from their perspective. And then 1914, World War I starts, and the Bund comes very much against it with the other Polish socialist parties, and they cooperate more and more. The Russian Empire loses the war very badly, and around 1915 the Germans enter Warsaw, and the Polish and the Russian organizations of the Bund are basically divided by a front line. They can't really cooperate with each other, and there is basically becomes a separate organization of the Bund in Poland, and of course there are Bundists in exile as well. When the Russian Revolution begins in 1917, the Bund is quite weak as a movement. It's not prepared for the kind of work that it did historically, but it does remain to some extent present. It's present in the Petrograd Soviet, for example. It has its own organization in Ukraine, which as it's one of the governments that forms, and it actually adopts some of the policies of national cultural autonomy. The Bundists have that sort of representation in Ukraine, but Ukraine gets torn between white Russians, nationalists, the German occupying army and its forces, Ukrainian nationalists, many of which are anti-Semitic, anarchists, and the Bolsheviks. So the government is not stable, does not continue of this kind. And when the Bolsheviks rise to power, a lot of socialists and anarchists, not just from the Bund, but generally, are swayed because they see this is the first time a socialist state is being attempted. You should try this effort, and there's and also the Bolsheviks enact a lot of political repression against their rivals within the socialist and labor movements. After World War I ends, the Bolsheviks tried to spread the revolution globally. At least that's a lot what their rhetoric aims. And in Poland, you also have the establishment of the Communist Workers' Party of Poland. Later, it will be the KPP. And there's a very vigorous debate in the Bund as to whether they should join. There are the way in which the Bolsheviks go about creating their Communist International is to say that there are 21 conditions that a party must fulfill to join the Comintern, and there's no negotiation that they can do. They see themselves as the vanguard. They succeeded. They're the ones who dictate stuff. And there are different factions in the Bund, and one faction accepts 16 out of 21 conditions. Another faction accepts 19 conditions, and the small minority wants to accept all of them. One of the main conditions that Bundists disagree with is a purge of reformists, or the purge within the reformist positions of the Bolsheviks. There's a lot of debate. The Bund tries to negotiate with the Comintern, but in the end, there's no possibility of compromise, and the communists force a split to a significant of a certain section of both the Bund and its youth organization, which is called the Zukunft, the future. And in Russia, the Bund dissolves in 1920. There's no a majority of those delegates who remain in the Bund end up seeing that there's not much that they can do, or that this is the government they need to support. A minority forms something called the Social Democratic Bund, and that largely fades by the mid-1920s. During this time, it's not helped by the fact that Poland and Soviet Russia are first in a state of quasi-war, and then they are actually in war. The Bund in Poland comes out against the war, against the attempted invasion of Russia by the Polish government to reclaim some of the lost territories, while the Bolsheviks are distracted. And until 1922, the Bund is basically considered illegal in Poland. There are very harsh repressions, arrests of people. They're set up in a concentration camp near Krakow, today in Krakow. Some of the early, rising stars, one might say, of the Bund at this time are Victor Alter and Henryk Ehrlich. They both come from Polish backgrounds, and you'll be hearing me reference them a few more times. Here you can see a few pictures of them. The one that you can see on the right is a stamp that was made of them by the underground Solidarity Post. The trade union in Poland honored them as important socialist and labor leaders. Maybe not socialist, but labor leaders in Poland. And why Solidarity, the anti-communist movement, would do that? We'll get to that. On the bottom left here as well, you can see a sticker with Henryk Ehrlich with a quote that there's a Polish left-wing merchandise company, and they released all these stickers of 100 Polish socialists for 100 years of independence a few years ago, and they had both Alter, Ehrlich, and Edelman. So, different point. 1920s are, the Bund enters 1920s in a difficult situation. They're not in the new Polish parliament. The organization is divided in the beginning whether they should even join the election. They're in a much smaller part of Yiddish, Eastern European Yiddish land than they originally were. There are no Bund organizations in Ukraine, in Belarus, in Russia, where they all existed before. There are small organizations of the Bund in Romania and Latvia. In Latvia, they even have a member of parliament there. And they're stuck between this permanent divide that's set up on the left between reformists and communists. They don't fit in with either. And likewise, after the Balfour Declaration in 1917, the ideas of Zionism come out from just like hypotheticals and very small agricultural colonies that have a few hundred, a few thousand people in Palestine. There's actually now support from the British government for Jewish immigration into Palestine in the 1920s. And in this time, you see a shift from what previously was a very conspiratorial organization to one that is practically semi-legal. There's still repressions, especially later on in the 1930s, but they reform. They start going away from what might be typically expected from a political party. They're not, they do of course compete in elections, or they end up competing in elections, but there's so much more than that. They're basically a mass movement of its kind. And most political parties operated in this way. This was something that was quite uniform. But nevertheless, the extent to which the Bund went with its size and membership is quite spectacular. So, of course, starting from the obvious ones, had very strong connections with the union movement. It had its own youth and children organizations, so Zukunft and SKIP, Socialist Children's Unions, and the Akadniks, which are less known about, but Arkady Kremer, one of the founders of the Bund, came from a religious Orthodox family, and so the Bund had specific working groups for children from Orthodox and Hasidic backgrounds who wanted to learn more about the outside world and wanted to learn more about Jewish socialism. A special working groups for them. It appealed to them in that sense. There was this whole school organization. The Bund believed in Yiddish as the language of the Jewish people. It didn't have any sort of sentimental value towards it. It was just the language that Jews spoke overwhelmingly. They believed that they should be rooted in that sense. And so they established. And they were also very concerned about the traditional methods of Jewish education, which were through hayders, which were considered very orthodox. They taught about religious affairs primarily. They didn't have practical skills. They didn't offer practical skills. They locked people into poverty. The teaching standard was very weak, unstandardized, and so they established a Zentrale Jiddische Schulorganisation, ZISCHO, which ran a network of schools with modern or contemporary pedagogical methods, and in Yiddish. So it didn't want the vast majority of Jewish youth went to Polish government schools. Of course, there were other organizations had their own schools, like the Talmud, the Zionist Hebraist schools, or Beis Yaakov for Orthodox girls. But the ZISCHO operated network of schools in Yiddish. ZISCHO also operated something that was basically unique for its time in Central and Eastern Europe. They operated a sanatorium that they named after one of the early thinkers of the Bund, Vladimir Medem, who passed in 1921. It was a sanatorium for kids from very poor working class families in Warsaw, but not only. They also accepted non-Jewish kids of Polish and German socialists, German workers from Silesia, for example. And they accepted their kids who were at risk of tuberculosis. They took them out of the slums of Warsaw if they were at risk of tuberculosis, and gave them a few months of fresh air in the countryside. And while having that time to recuperate, they also established what they called a socialist children's republic. They tried to give the kids as much initiative as they could in running the place, in making decisions, in discussions, and it wasn't any sort of ideological indoctrination either. There were religious children that were admitted into the Medem Sanatorium, and they were allowed to pray, for example. There wasn't any sort of It wasn't something that was considered part of the curriculum, but if kids wanted to pray, then they had that opportunity by all means. There was a whole variety of publications that came from the Bund. Volkszeitung was the main one, the people's newspaper. They sold copies of it on Shabbos, and they had there was a big battle in the 1920s between Orthodox rabbis and who encouraged harassing of newspaper sellers who sold newspapers on Shabbos. Lebensfragen was a more theoretical publication, and then you had a few in Polish as well. Bundu, it was the attempt of the Bund to show its perspective to non-Yiddish speaking Poles. It considered always their opinion to be very important. And Wolna Młodzież, the free youth, that was established later on in the 1930s for children and youth who spoke Polish, because that was the language that they assimilated into. It had its own sports organization. The first goal that was scored for the Polish national football team in their first ever match was scored by a player of Morgenstern, Józef Klotz, played for the team of Morgenstern in Prague. It had a feminist organization, the Jewish Working Woman. Of all the organizations of the interwar period, this was actually one of the least successful ones. While in the conspiratorial period, it was more common for women to be part of the Bund's leadership, there were still individual women that were present, but certainly there was a sort of invisible barrier that existed to some extent, even if that wasn't something that was in policy, which should be considered one of the certain limitations and failures of the interwar Bund. It only had a few hundred members at the end. Here's a screenshot from a documentary that was done on the Medem Sanatorium, which you can find on YouTube. It was done as a fundraiser because they raised a lot of money from the Jewish Labour Movement in America. It's a very, very interesting watch, especially the first few minutes where one of the leaders of the Jewish Labour Movement in America, B.C. Vladek, talks about all of their plans for expansion. It's very heartbreaking knowing what happens to many of the kids. It's many of the children in this film end up being resistance fighters during the war. Here you can see the Morgenstern's delegation to the 1931 Olympiad, Workers' Olympiad in Vienna. They're marching here in front of the Austrian Parliament. And this is the newspaper Arbeitersportler, and it says, we have to, comrades, prepare yourselves for the Vienna Olympiad 1931. We have to there show the strength of our movement. There are a few more organizations, we'll go through these quickly. There were self-defense organizations, there was harassment by Polish fascists of Jews more and more in the 1930s. And as well by the communists, who, especially from the 1920 until 1933, considered Bundists to be social fascists. They considered them to be more of a threat because they believed the revolution was imminent. They established people's kitchens, consumer cooperatives for people to have cheap access to food, and even had some attempts at worker cooperatives themselves through the Robotnicza Centrala Kredytowa, although there's less information on that. A special cultural association, the Kulturliga, with a library in Warsaw named after one of the early leaders of the movement, Bronisław Gnosek. They had a right-to-work office. For any Americans who know about what right-to-work means in the American context, this is nothing of the sort. The Bund tried with all of its influence to be able to place Jews into public positions like tram drivers, for example. There was a big campaign for them to be able to break the barrier of discrimination that very often municipal governments have their workers. And one of the leaders of that bureau was Shmuel Ziegelboim, who will come out earlier. Also interesting, an emigration bureau. So the Bund didn't have some sort of view that you have to stay at all costs in Poland. They believed that emigrationism, as they would describe it, was not a solution. They viewed that, however, if there was someone in the movement that was interested in leaving the country, perhaps to join their family, even if they wanted to go to a place like America or Palestine, there was a special office that the Bund used to help their connections abroad, and they maintained connections abroad of that kind. And also important is that the Bund did not limit itself to its own bubble. They also tried to influence quote-unquote apolitical organizations through their presence in there. They used that as well. The Pen Club in Warsaw, the Jewish Theatre in Krakow had a very strong Bundist influence. The Jewish Theatre in Krakow has just recently been re-established, by the way. And when it comes to culture as well, the Bund basically took the principle that any cultural organizing that isn't opposed to their values was positive. They did not see it that there has to check a certain number of lists in order to be acceptable. It didn't have that sort of Stalinist line, one might say. Here are a few more pictures of Bundists through the interwar period. Bernard Goldstein in the top right, a very important figure of the Bundist self-defense groups. His memoirs are incredible. They're available in English. The Central Committee of the Bund during the 1931 Olympiad and Socialist International Congress. In the middle here you see the only woman on it, Anna Rosenthal from Vilna. On here on the left you have Israel Lichtenstein, who was the leader of the Bund in Lodz. And on the right you have Bella Shapiro, who was the leader of the Bund in Lublin, one of the few local leaders who was a woman. And here in the middle you have Banish Mihailovich's gravestone. He was a very important theoretician of the Bund when it came to engagement within mainstream Jewish communities. Is everyone following so far, by the way? Does anyone have any questions? Good. So all of this work starts to fail. The Bund connects again with they joined the Reformist Labour and Socialist International, although they're very much on the left wing of it. They're not sticking to the reformist orthodoxy that becomes more and more common. So, for example, they try and encourage the German Social Democrats in 1930-31 to increase their deficit spending for public works towards saving the economy during the crisis. And the German Social Democrats refuse it. And part of that policy recovery of the crisis is an important factor for the Nazis rising to power. And so Bund expands its international presence in that. Anti-Semitism becomes more and more of a political factor in Europe after 1933 because a lot of people start copying Hitler and the Nazis, especially on the Polish right. And Poland itself becomes more and more of a dictatorship. Józef Piłsudski, a leader of Poland, of the Polish independence struggle, launches a coup in 26 and becomes more and more of an authoritarian figure. The 1928 elections are considered the last semi-free ones, and after that it's more and more repression. What's also important is that immigration is blocked basically from Poland. A lot of Jews, if they wanted to, would have wanted to leave Poland, but in the early 1920s, the Americans begin introducing strict immigration quotas for Jews and Southern Europeans in particular. After 1930s, the economic crisis hits mandatory Palestine rather strongly, and after 1936, in 1929 there are big riots in Hebron. A lot of Jews and Palestinian Arabs get killed. There's a worry that pogroms and violence against Jews makes that place unstable. And in 1936, the Arab Revolt breaks out in the Mandate, and that stops the possibility of reliable immigration there. There aren't many more possibilities towards Western Europe, and what's important as well is that even the most, and this is something that I think it's, with the benefit of hindsight, it's always easy to judge what was, quote unquote, the correct choice in this situation. The most radical emigration plan in the interwar period from Europe was Zev Jabotinsky, so the right-wing Zionists evacuation plan, which he presented and wanted to cooperate with anti-Semitic governments in implementing, which would have seen an emigration of 750,000 Jews from Eastern Europe to mandatory Palestine over 10 years. So it takes very easy calculation that 750,000 over 10 years, well, there were 3.5 million Jews in Poland alone. That doesn't include Russia, that doesn't include Hungary or Romania. So emigration en masse as a means of safety was simply practically not an option that they had. And so you have a lot of people that just, in this time, that consider Poland, with its economic crisis, increasing anti-Semitism, and continued further discrimination and violence against Jews. The young people that grow up, they can't leave, they don't have economic opportunities, that they're a generation without a future. And in this situation, in a situation where where Zionist and Orthodox political parties, which were considered more of the establishment of the community, they don't have the kinds of connections that the Bund has with its counterparts in the Polish or socialist movements in Poland. The Bund becomes a much more effective force of opposition to the status quo. In 1936, there's a pogrom in Przytyk, and in response, the Bund organizes a week later a general strike of Jews in Poland for one day, the 16th of March, 1936. And in solidarity, a significant amount of the Polish labor movement joins. And this becomes a focal point of resistance, that, with Jews being 10% of the population of Poland, significant stoppage of work is has a very significant impact. They repeat this the next year, and there was I think a New York Times correspondent in Poland that described the mood, that everything shut down. The correspondent said that the streets of Poland were filled by a proud people, proud and battle ready. And this time, this allows the Bund to show that they are the ones who are counteracting anti-Semitism. They are the ones who have self-defense forces, they are the ones who have connections with the Polish labor movement. And so they try more and more their luck with the Jewish communal institution elections, the kahillas, which in the previous elections the Bund boycotted because they considered them to be reactionary. There were various points of debate. Initially, the leadership of the Bund doesn't want to participate in them, but there is pressure from the lower masses of the membership to participating in them. And there are efforts by the Polish government and the Orthodox Aguda towards suppressing the vote of the Bund. They try and do some machinations. They don't work. In many places, the Bund exceeds expectation within the Jewish communal institutions. In some cities, for example, Piotrków, which is a small city, Jews about 50% of the population, industrial city near Lodz, central Poland, they get an absolute majority in the community. In 1938, there are municipal elections, which, unlike the parliamentary elections, are relatively free. And in these elections, most of the Jewish parties have their united list. There is a united Jewish list, and there is a Bund. There is a list of the Bund. And in most major cities, the Bund gets more votes than all the other Jewish political parties combined. Of the 20 council members of Warsaw who were Jewish in 1938, the Bund had 17. One was a Zionist and 2 were Orthodox. So it becomes undeniable with this wave of support and strength. The Bund tries to organize more in lines of, they organize a workers' congress against anti-Semitism, for example. The ranks of the movement swell. It is undeniably the strongest Jewish political party in Poland by far. They have thousands of membership, activists throughout its different organizations. They have hundreds of elected officials. They are a social movement. They are active in self-defense. And according, at least to some sympathetic sources, the strength of the government and the dictatorship is waning. The point is that the Bund takes the self-defense of the Jewish community as its own, as its point, and they have a strategy that seems to be working. And in fact, had there been elections, then the idea is in November 1938 that if there had the next elections been free, then the Bund would be able to be part of the Polish government in coalition with the Polish Socialist Party. Those elections never take place. The Bund is active in the defense of Warsaw. After a week, the Polish government wants to evacuate Warsaw, and the Polish socialists refuse to do so. They establish worker brigades who will defend Warsaw, and the Bund joins in on that. As part of the leadership evacuates, and they get captured on the 17th of September 1939, so 2.5 weeks after the war starts. The Soviet Union invades Poland, and the NKVD, so the Stalinist secret police, treats Bundists as a priority target. Ehrlich and Alter, the two leaders of the Bund I mentioned earlier, are recognized while trying to escape, and they get arrested. They will later go on. They will be released in 1941 after Germany invades the Soviet Union, and then they'll be rearrested again later in 1941, and then they're murdered on Stalin's orders during World War II. In terms of what the Bund does during World War II, there are two fronts. They work in the underground. Here you can see, on the left, you can see the cover of the book The Ghetto is Fighting by Marek Edelman, one of the last leaders of the Jewish Combat Organization in the Warsaw Ghetto. And on the right, you have a recently, quote-unquote, rediscovered cover of a youth publication of the Bund in the Warsaw Ghetto with that symbol. And here you have a translation of what is that little text that you see over here. That's this in Yiddish. I mentioned Shmuel Ziegelboim earlier as one of the organizers of the Right to Work Bureau, and he becomes a crucial figure at this point now. He's originally from Lodz, but he finds himself in Warsaw during the occupation in September 1939. He's one of the only few people from the Central Committee of the Bund. He comes from a very poor family. He started going to work when he was about 6 or 7 years old. He had over 10 siblings. And he becomes, the Germans demand the creation of a Jewish council, the Judenrat, who are effectively hostages. They take people from all Jewish political parties to be part of it. By November 1939, the Nazi occupying government, or occupying the regime, wants to create a ghetto. And they create a ghetto that covers a significant part of where Jews live in Warsaw, but not all of it. They have to move Jews into the ghetto in order to succeed. And the Judenrat is unsure of how to respond to this. At first, they want to acquiesce to it because they don't see another option. And in response to this, Ziegelboim thoroughly protests against it and goes out in front of the Judenrat. There are thousands of Jews that are waiting the decision of what to do. And he gives this big speech about, at all cost, avoid getting into the ghetto. Do not allow yourselves to be pushed into it that way. Resist in whatever way you can. In the end, the Judenrat, which is formed of 12 people, decides that they want to protest against it, but they do not hold any sort of mass resistance like Ziegelboim envisioned. And now Ziegelboim has publicly come out as a Jewish socialist against the Nazi occupying government. So he goes into hiding and he escapes through Germany, actually, but he goes through Belgium, France after 1940. He ends up in America, and then he goes back to Britain and he becomes part of the government in exile. Through this time, the Bundist and Polish Jewish underground networks get more and more news about the Holocaust. Reports start coming in 41, 42. And Ziegelboim takes them then as seriously as he possibly can. And he tries to make appeals publicly to the Polish government in exile. He connects with the Labour Party, which is in the same international as the Bund, towards putting any sort of pressure on the Allied governments to conduct a mass leafleting campaign of the German population, towards bombing the tracks to the death camps in Auschwitz and Treblinka, which is not done. His appeals get somewhat covered, but the basic response from the Allied governments to the Holocaust is that they will sort it out after the war. The last active effort of resistance is the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising in April 1943. The Bundist unite with basically all other political parties to forming the Jewish Combat Organization, mainly youth leaders. So here you can see on the top left, that's Michał Klepfish, who's a chemist who organized, he made bombs, and he died on the second day of the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, shielding his comrades from a machine gun. He got awarded the highest military order of Poland for that. Henek Rus, one of the leaders of the Zukunft, the Bundist youth movement in the Warsaw Ghetto, and Marek Edelman, the last leader of the Jewish Combat Organization. They last out for 3 weeks. They enact certain losses on the Germans. And on the right, you see the last letter that Shmuel Ziegelboim ever pens, and it's a note to the head of the Polish government in exile. And here you can see some of it. I'll read out quickly. I cannot continue to live and to be silent while the remnants of Polish Jewry, whose representative I am, are being murdered. My comrades in the Warsaw Ghetto fell with arms in their hands in their last heroic battle. I am not permitted to fall like them, together with them, but I belong with them to their mass grave. By my death, I wish to give expression to my most profound protest against the inaction in which the world watches and permits the destruction of the Jewish people. And this last part is something that is part of the letter, of course, but it's less frequently cited. And I want to keep this in mind for later. In particular, my life belongs to the Jewish people of Poland, and therefore I hand it over to them now. I yearn that the remnant that has remained of the millions of Polish Jews may live to see liberation together with the Polish masses, and that it shall be permitted to breathe freely in Poland and in a world of freedom and socialistic justice, in compensation for the inhuman suffering and torture inflicted on them. And I believe that such a Poland will arise and such a world will come about. Ziegelboim wanted originally the news that he heard when the Jewish politicians in exile heard the news from Poland. The original aim that they wanted to do, that people from Poland were calling them, was to chain themselves in front of their government institutions, to launch hunger strikes, to protest as well as they can. Ziegelboim wanted to do this, but he was dissuaded because it was told that it would be censored by the press during the war. And so he thought that by committing suicide, that would be the way in which he can influence something. It doesn't work. And the Bund exists in Poland in very sort of individual forces. People like Marek Edelman and Bernard Goldstein fight during the Warsaw Uprising in 1944. A lot of the times they hide the fact that they're Jewish from the Polish resistance. Something that must be taken into account. I don't want to launch into the whole discussion about the Polish culpability or the culpability from Polish population during the Holocaust, but it must be said that not a single Jewish partisan unit got integrated into the Home Army, into the Polish main underground resistance forces. After the war, Bundists find themselves basically completely scattered around the world. There are Bundists who are who existed before the war in America. The General Secretary of the Bund, Emanuel Novogródzki, and luckily for himself, ends up being in America in September 1939. That's how he survives. But there are Bundist organizations or groups that they exist in Argentina, Uruguay, South Africa, China, Australia, and in a lot of places, these are people who have lost their entire families, and the people who they knew from their youth movements that they grew up with are the only ones that they have connection with. There is an attempt to re-establish the Bund in Poland. You can see its 50th anniversary Congress in 1947, but it rather quickly gets dismantled by the communists in 1949. There's greater pressure. A lot of people leave Poland who are not able to participate openly or do not wish to operate under Stalinist conditions, and so there is no longer this Eastern European Yiddish land that they can openly operate in. And furthermore, in the next few years, a democratic socialist organization is unable to work either in the conditions of Soviet communism or in the West with either reformist, truly reformist parties, or in the case of America, during the Red Scare and anti-socialist, anti-communist feelings during the McCarthy era. And so where Bundists are, they continue their organizations. There is a World Coordination Committee. For the first time, there is a world organization of the Bund. And they continue to exist, but they primarily exist as social spaces for people who grew up in the movement and have that very strong secular Jewish socialist Yiddishist identity, including in Israel. There is a Bundist organization in Israel, which you can see here on the bottom left. This is a documentary that was made of them about 10 years ago. More like 15, 20 years ago. Of course, the establishment of the State of Israel presents a challenge to the traditional way in which the Bund conducted politics, and I'll get to that in a moment as well. What you can also see here is on the bottom left, there is more and more of a focus on the history of the movement. That's where a lot of the pressure gets put. There are 3 big volumes called The Generations of Bundist, Bundisten, that are published in the 50s of other histories, local histories of the Bund or individual leaders. And there are also some efforts towards keeping youth organizations. So what you have over here in the top right is Camp Hemshech, which was the Bund youth organization in America, which existed in New York State until the 1970s. What you can also see here in the bottom is that people that grew up in the Bundist community milieu become involved in other struggles as well. So the daughter of Michał Klepfish, over here in the top left, is called Irena Klepfish. She's born in the Warsaw Ghetto. She gets smuggled out with her mother and lives after the war in New York, and she's still alive today. So gradually, as you can imagine, people that grew up in this political environment, there isn't as much of an effort towards revitalizing the organization as an active fighting political force. There are attempts in the 50s and 60s, but they're not particularly successful. So over time, what you have is a focus on keeping the community and writing histories, and they begin really to die off. They become a much older organization. People that don't have familial connections with the Bund are not particularly involved in it. And so organizations like the one you see in the bottom right, what happens often is that with the death of one person that was carrying the organization along, the organization shuts down. This was what happened in Tel Aviv in 2019, where Itzhak Luden, who grew up in the Bundist youth movement in Poland and emigrated to Israel in 1956, died, and they decided to just wrap it up. We'll get back to those sorts of organizations in a little bit, but what I wanted to say now is, why am I telling you all this? Why is this, I assume, you find, many of you will find this an interesting history, but why is this relevant today as a point of political organizing? I think there are some ways in which you can subdivide these into some basic categories. I've got 5 out here. The last one is a surprise. You might be able to guess which one it is. And also I wanted to include over here the point about socialism. It's the first one to start off. And mentioning this pamphlet. This is one of the only original primary sources on the Bund in English, which was a speech by Henrik Ehrlich that was published by the Bund Club of New York in, I think, 1934 or 35, something like that. So yeah, to start off regarding what the Bund considered as socialism. So the Bund was a revolutionary party. They believed in an ultimate need of an economic transformation of society, and they believed in the focus on workers controlling their workplaces. I mentioned that they joined the Socialist International. They were on the left of that reformist organization. They were very critical of the Communist Party and the Soviet Union further on as they existed. The communists, including Jewish communists, did not believe in national cultural autonomy. And of course, a lot of the Bundists were very disgusted by the complete suppression of political freedom in the Soviet Union. And in the years 1928-33 that I was talking about, the Communist Party of Poland was particularly, since they were an illegal party in Poland, and because of that, they often resorted to quite gangsterist methods of organizing. They engaged in assassination attempts on Bundist leaders. They even attacked you remember the Medem Sanatorium that I mentioned? In 1931, the communists, Jewish and non-Jewish communists, violently attacked the Medem Sanatorium while children are inside. Nobody gets injured, but it is a very souring of relations. And of course, after the truth comes out that Stalin executed Emmet and Alta in 1943, that is just it in terms of the connections. It's also interesting, so when it comes to on one hand you can say that the Bund would certainly have some forms of reformist socialism because they did not cut themselves off from mainstream Jewish communal institutions. They believed in the daily action and helping of its members. They believed that the organization exists for practical reasons. It never had any sort of direct connection to anarchist thought. There was, of course, a very important Jewish anarchist movement. But if you talk about the practicalities of organizing, the forms of non-state autonomy, or the lack of viewing state capture as the goal in which your organization can engage on itself, I think that there's much more of a stronger case that the Bund can connect towards libertarian socialist ideas rather than Marxist-Leninist ones. When it comes to Jewish identity, the Bund considered the Jews to be a nation or a people in the same way that they considered Poles or Russians or Italians to be a people. They understood themselves as being the Jewish representation in the international socialist and labor movement. Although over time their cultural work began being more connected towards specifically Jewish ideas that were not strictly in a class struggle context. And as I said, they didn't view they viewed a universal global Jewish identity as too abstract to be rooted in local communal principles. And that early decision that was made in the early 1900s certainly had an influence after the war, when the old Yiddish land was no longer a possibility for them to organize. And there's certainly tensions that people that connect to Buddhism today have to think about. On the subject of Jewish values, the Bund was not particularly interested in any sorts of metaphysical or spiritual ideas of what Jewish values are. Like for Americans here, there is a lot of influence on ideas of, for example, tikkun olam or tzedek tirdof. Bundists did not use that sort of language. They were not particularly interested in that. And a lot of their rhetoric on religion was generally quite similar to, like 50-year-old atheists that suddenly discover that there's a God and they want to debate it all the time. However, as I mentioned, there wasn't any sort of demand of atheism within the movement. I mentioned the thing about prayer in the Madam Sanatorium. A lot, if you look at some sources on the questionnaires that were done by youth of the Bund, you'd see that actually about 50% of them, in ones that have been, there's a researcher called Magdalena Kozłowska who looked into this in detail, about 50% of them actually engaged in prayer. They did so while knowing that they're answering towards a movement that was generally not too into that. Also, when it came to religious Jews, the Bund opposed any sort of legal restrictions on shechita, on ritual slaughter. They believed it to be just an anti-Semitic kana, the kind. They distributed matzah during Pesach through their welfare networks. And what's also very particularly interesting, they called for the decommodification of kosher certifications. They believed that kosher certification should not be something that individual rabbis or religious organizations should make money off of. They should take away from private, and it should just be a public service that the Jewish communal institutions engage in. What's also interesting, when it comes to the perception of whether the Bund was nationalist or separatist, they believed in the primary form of class struggle. They professed, at least, to feel more connection to Polish workers than to Jewish capitalists. In fact, if you look at the history of the sports organizations, there's one incident that was reported in the Bundist press. There was a Polish worker club that played against like Maccabi or something, and the Bundists supported the Polish worker club. They also refused to engage in any sort of tribalism or Jewish nationalism. They refused to engage in a unified Jewish front against anti-Semitism, for example. Even on occasions where it could have been politically expedient to do so. I mentioned Bernard Goldstein already a few times. When they did their self-defense patrols around Warsaw, they protected Jewish merchants from Polish anti-Semitic gangs. However, even though that wasn't their primary constituency, however, Bundists refused to take payments as thanks, or any sort of thanks from these people. At all costs, they wanted to phrase their struggle as anti-fascist or socialist versus fascist. They never ever wanted to reduce it to a Jewish versus Polish struggle. That's very important to keep in mind. That they believed in humanist values first and foremost. That's also why, if you look at the Bundist publications inside the Warsaw Ghetto, they celebrated, for example, the anniversary of Koloman Walisz, who was an Austrian socialist that was executed by the Austrian government in the 1930s, while there were Austrian members of the SS guarding the outside of the Warsaw Ghetto. They by no means wanted to reduce any of their struggles towards any sort of ethnic divisions or race war or anything like that. That was completely antithetical to what they did. When it comes to the Jewish street, the Bund always wanted to build more support along their traditional constituency, which they considered to be the Jewish working class. And they had a much more inclusive definition of what this was, as opposed to like strictly worker industry, use a hammer, big machinery, 500 people in the workplace. They viewed, for example, apprentices often as people who shared the fate of the working class. And it did not wish to stay in its own secure little political bubble. And one of the slogans that it used was "In die Gassen zu die Massen," in the streets to the masses, because in interwar Poland and in many other places, the Jewish street, rather than the synagogue, was considered to be the Jewish communal place, right? And I think that this should be considered like food for thought for people who connect to the legacy of the Bund. What is the Jewish street today? What are the Jewish masses? Like, are these even concepts that are in any way relevant towards us? Are they potentially ones that could be relevant in the future? And yeah, and also what I mentioned earlier about the Bund being becoming the strongest party in Poland. I think it's particularly important for people on the Jewish left to not allow themselves to believe that they have to always be a minority of a minority, right? That's what the Bund was in many points of its history, but there were points of its history where, through its work and through its appeal, addressing the problems of the Jewish community, they were able to convince a majority, or at least a substantial portion of the community, to their thought. They were not self-alienating. They did not believe that they always have to be in this way. Finally, regarding Zionism, I made a very clear point regarding not talking about it to this point, because I think it's counterproductive for people to present the Bund as a primarily anti-Zionist organization. The Bund actively campaigned against Zionism. They viewed it as a form of escapism. They were almost as harsh on the socialist variety of Zionism as to the non-socialist general political ones. You can see this in people like Vladimir Medem. There's an article that he wrote in 1917 where he frames a poor Jew starving on the street while there is a big poster around him calling for donations for Jews to colonize or emigrate to Palestine. There is a very important piece that has been translated into English by Henrik Ehrlich, which is Zionism a liberatory democratic movement? Very, very interesting read, and in my view, very relevant towards politics today. Victor Alter visited Palestine and Eretz Yisrael in 1925, and he wrote a book about it, that NS Wegen Palästina, The Truth About Palestine. I haven't read it. It's only fully accessible in Yiddish, but there are some translations, at least excerpts in the works now. And what you can see over here is some publications that Joe has provided me a few weeks ago regarding the voice of the Bund. So it's the Polish language publication regarding Zionism from around 1919. You can see here the bankruptcy of Zionism on the question of Palestine. I'll get back to these two in a moment. What needs to be clear, I think, from everything that I've said so far, the Bund's reason for existence was not to oppose Zionism. They did not exist because Zionists exist. It had its own positive vision of what it wanted to accomplish, and it viewed Zionist movements as its competitors. However, despite a lot of the rhetoric that you have of like very strictly against socialist Zionists in the interwar period, in certain circumstances, actually, the Bund cooperated with primarily Parley Zion Left. So the most left-wing organization of the Zionist movement that was not part of the World Zionist Organization. It viewed Yiddish as a language for education. It did not negate the diaspora, and it viewed itself as working towards a joint Jewish-Arab future in Palestine. That also talks about the historical legacy of what Zionist movements were in the interwar period. So Parley Zion Left was a minority, was a much smaller organization than the Bund in Poland, but it did have its own sports organizations, and it cooperated with the Bund in Zischok, the Yiddishist school systems. In certain occasions, the Bund and Parley Zion Left even ran on local election slates together, like it had its own coalition party, although on a local level and not as advertised. Certainly a subject for academic research, actually. There hasn't been much, it's just been noted, but it hasn't really been examined in that way. Obviously, with the practical reality of Zionism today, the approach to it by the Jewish left needs to be different than it was in the 1930s, when only relatively early glimpses of what today we have existed. But nevertheless, when it comes to a lot of Jewish left organizations, whether in America or Europe or elsewhere, it's very easy to criticize the status quo. It's very easy to say that what is happening now is bad, very bad, terrible. The point is that there needs to be some sort of positive vision of what do you want, how are you going to get there, what practical steps can you take. That's what the legacy of the Bund, I think, teaches us absolutely crucial. Right, almost done. The last section is the shortest one. There are 3 points or 3 case studies, I may say, regarding what Bundists are up to today. And let's go on with the oldest one. When I said that Bundist organizations have primarily died out or no longer exist, there is one major exception to that. There are some organizations that have like a history or connection to the Bund historically, but there is one organization of the Bund that has existed non-stop since the interwar period. And that organization, of all places, is in Melbourne, Australia. Right? Melbourne, Australia. The reason as to why there was a significant amount of people from in Australia is because one of the leaders of the Bund in Bialystok, Jacob Wax, managed to escape in 1940 through Vilnius by train to Shanghai, and then from Shanghai made his way to Melbourne. There were some people there who were a bit earlier, and then there was a significant connection between the Bund and allowing for Jews from Poland to emigrate to Australia, and the Australian government accepted them. Not to cast too good of a light for Australia's migration policies in the 1940s, very racist. But what differentiated the Bund in Melbourne from a lot of the other organizations was its critical focus on the youth. They maintained SCIF, the youth organization, which you can see here on different photos, and that allowed them for a continuous rebuilding of the movement, not from people outside. It just became like a continual family organization, one might say. The main place where they meet is called the Jacob Wax Center, named after Jacob Wax. They have sports, events like the Morgenstern organization, they run marathons and such. And here in the bottom you have Josh Burns, who's a member of the Australian Parliament who grew up in Skip. Whether he counts as a Bundist member of Parliament, I think it's a bit of a stretch, but it's nevertheless an interesting development. The Bund is not primarily linked to the labor movement as such. It's not a radical organization. Economically, they are quite social democratic. Nevertheless, they do a lot of good work. Recently, they were very strongly engaged in the campaign towards having a constitutional indigenous representation in the Australian Parliament, which unfortunately failed. And they're very active in the local Yiddishist sphere. In fact, Melbourne is, I think, today has the only day Yiddish secular school in the world, the Shalom Aleichem School. When it comes to questions on Israel-Palestine, there is a significant divide between the older members and the younger members. Some people might have heard or hear voices that Melbourne Bund is this, Melbourne Bund is that. I think it's a bit premature. As for their actions regarding the fact that they are the only organization in the Bund today, they very much like to stress that the Bund is not dead, that they are the Bund, that they continue. But they never wanted to be in the position where they are the ones who revitalize the Bundist organizing nationwide. That's not why they were established, that's not what they want. Nevertheless, Bundist organizing now around the world, quite a lot of it is in contact with Melbourne and friendly terms. When it comes to Café Bund, I mentioned earlier on, Café Bund started off as a project with me and a few other Jewish and non-Jewish organizers who were interested in the point of the perspective of the Bund. Primarily people as well connected strongly to the labor movement in Krakow today, especially in the gastronomic sector. People who are, we see a lot of the very bad working conditions that exist over there. And so the idea was basically to root it in that gastronomic cafe food tradition, to that to be organized on a cooperative basis, and also have a special cultural educational section that is that draws significantly from the legacy of the Bund. We've had several social events. We've Shabbos dinners. We've organized a library that now has about, we started in July with 12 books. Now it has about 200, and soon we'll be having an open appeal. You can send it to us. And we're organizing, we have our own physical space that is a cafe bookshop cooperative called Ognivo, like chain link. And that allows us to have meetings whenever we want, to store things there whenever we want, and be open to the public. From 5 to 10 p.m., 6 days a week, people can come in Krakow and learn about the Bund. These photos that you have here of me holding up the check sign, this is from our Jewish blog at the May Day demonstration, which quite a few of you were at. That was the first explicit Jewish presence at a May Day demonstration in Poland in generations, in decades. There are different ways of what counts as war, where May Day demonstrations were, there was a Jewish forced presence during the communist times, but this was the one modern type of its kind. We had people there from Prague, from Kolin, other towns in Poland, Krakow, one person from Vilna, one person from Berlin. I think it went very well. Perhaps something next New Year. Next year it's going to be the 120th anniversary of the Galician Bund, 1st May 1905. Then they wrote this document called that was titled Vosmir Viln, what we want, and that's potentially a good opportunity to do something nice. In terms of other projects, there's so much stuff that can be done in Krakow. Stuff regarding the democratization of Jewish communal institutions, which are either non-democratic or corrupt or both. There are some basic, amenities that we're working on in the Jewish community. We're working on reopening the Jewish Library, which exists in Krakow, but it's not open to the public. There's a lot of stuff regarding the way in which the Jewish quarter in Krakow itself looks. There's a lot of older tourism. There's very little housing, affordable housing that exists in the city, while there's also a lot of abandoned buildings. There's a lack of local industry. There's very bad car culture. There's a lot like traditional places that could be community spaces. And then these are all these points that are connected. Of course, we're connected towards the general, both within the Jewish community and the Jewish and the non-Jewish left. And yeah, several other projects and ideas that we have. We're organizing a Yiddish music night next Friday. That's looking like it's going to draw quite a few people. We have a DJ that's doing pleasant electronic music from Brooklyn. And finally, so over the last year or so, there's been an effort to re-establish, to not get the Melbourne folks angry, because they don't like it when you say to re-establish the Bund, but to re-establish the Bund as an international force. There have been efforts of people for a long time towards, let's rebuild the Bund. The Bund would be great if it existed today. Now, re-establishing a movement that is 125 years old, that existed in very different conditions, with little, there's a lot of people that say the Bund sounded like a good idea, but what it practically means today, there's not that much writing that's been done about it, in my opinion. A lot of the stuff is quite surface level. Although in Prague, one thing that we are working on is a zine that talks about the modern principles of Bundist organizing. We're going to be fundraising for it very soon, and it's in Polish. A lot of stuff is, some is original, most of it's translated. And here you can see various different local, shall I say, Instagram accounts at this stage. So from the top row is Chicago, Montana, of all places, Montana, New York, Binghamton, University campus, New York State, Philadelphia, DMV, the Americans, that's not the Department of Motor Vehicles, that's DC, Maryland, Virginia, the Carolinas, and SoCal, which is, here it's written Cal, which I think is quite funny. And so, as you can see, for example, from here, a lot of this is still very much like a blob of organizing, like people who think that the Bund is cool, but it's still a lot of like, you know, people that don't know each other. In a sense, you don't know if you can trust everyone fully. People have the right, you know, the experience, and so it's been taking a lot of time to actually get things off the ground, for there to be some sort of representative body that can do a lot of the very basic things that you need if you want to have an organization, like what is membership, what does a chapter mean, how are decisions made, and so what's happening now is just today actually. The elections to the provisional steering committee have finished. It's a simple yes/no vote for every person. I'm one of the candidates, the only one from Europe. You also have one person from California, one from Montana, and one from New York. Hopefully, we will get elected. That's like the start towards making decisions as a group and actually making a little bit of structure. And yeah, that's it. If anyone has any questions, by all means.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks, Zach. That was really great. We have a few more minutes for questions here, and then even after we might at some point have to. Soon, I think we'll have to vacate this room because they're preparing for a concert later tonight. But we can continue discussions in the rest of the cafe. But yeah, there's any questions now? Well, we'll still have Zach on stage. Yeah, Mathieu?
You need a microphone?
It might show up better on the recording, although if I can reach you.
So, so thank you for coming, and I have like 2 questions, but I don't know if there's a time for it or not. So maybe the first one, which is more important, like you was ending with the talk about like the nowadays movement, and I was like my question is quite simple. Is like in the these beginnings of the movement, like international wise or like local wise or just regional wise, doesn't matter. If let's say the focus should be only like onto the Jewish community, the local or like in the country wise, or also like to the outside of the region, like for example, like what you are doing in Krakow, like to the Western Middle and so on. And the second question is like a historical one, but I think we'll leave it to the discussion later because it's really specific, like connected to my research and that's it. So I don't know if it's like interesting for
I'd be happy to hear it now.
Okay, so like
we'll collect questions and then.
So basically, like I'm doing like a research of radicalization of Jewish youth, mainly in Poland in the 30s, and the question is like, I think the youth generation was like really crucial, like for the energy of the establishment of the Bund and so on. So like, do you think like even like nowadays, maybe like for example, United States, you can see like American Jewish youth being like crucial to the like, let's say, yeah, like kind of these heretics of the like the Jewish establishment in the communities and so on, and also like regarding to the relationship to State of Israel and so on. So if you think like maybe the youth generation, even like back then and nowadays, is like the crucial one, or is it just some my thesis or whatnot. Thank you.
Thanks. Are there any more questions before we? Let's say.
Can I ask you to come, but just it's very short. What would you say is the Jewish street today? Like what kind of, maybe it's continuation, but like who is the Bund addressing?
I have one question also. I'll miss you.
I have thoughts on that. I'd be very happy to speak for a bit, but
yeah, I just wanted to see if you might say a little bit more about the relationship between this, let's say, Bundist attitude towards organizing and the various organizations that already exist for solidarity, Jewish organizations for solidarity with Palestinians or for peace in the Middle East, like Jewish Voice for Peace, and so on. I know you have reasons for thinking that the Bund can contribute something that those organizations aren't yet doing. So if you have time to say anything more on that. And are there any more questions?
obviously.
Okay, so yeah, you have a.
Okay. These are all great questions. Thank you very much. Yeah, when it comes to I think so. Starting off with your first question, when it comes to the point, I think of Bundist organizing then and what it can be now is that there are Jewish affairs are affairs of everyone. The question, whether it comes to labor movement, I didn't speak too much about the relevance of the idea that what are Jewish workers today? Is there such a thing as a Jewish working class? In comparison to whether there is a working class. Also, first of all, I think it's important as well to say that every community can be quite different. There are conditions in the Czech Republic or anywhere else. The question, so to give the example of gastronomic issues or workplace issues, housing issues, these are all things that impact everyone. Everyone who has to work for a living or who has housing issues. I think I forgot which early leader of the Bund was. It might be Clement, I'm not sure. But he said that Jewish workers are discriminated on the account of being Jewish and on the account of being workers. So when it comes to something like labor rights, or as an example, the fact of someone who has to work for a living, who works minimum wage, or has to take care of children or parents, they are disproportionately less likely towards connecting with forms of culture and entertainment that are difficult to access for them. For Jewish people, or in the case of places like Poland and the Czech Republic, people with Jewish background, I think what this means is that people from working class backgrounds, or people that are from smaller communities or who have to take care of their parents, something like that, they are disproportionately likely to be able to engage in mainstream Jewish communal institutions, right? Especially if we're looking at places like Poland or the Czech Republic, there's a large number of people who have Jewish background, disproportionately to how many people are actually involved in the community. And there are certain barriers that exist to people engaging with their Jewish communal identity. One is anti-Semitism, one is the the incompetency of mainstream Jewish communal institutions, or not being able to address it. Another one is socioeconomic factors. If you're working minimum wage, or if you have any housing issues, or if there isn't good public transport in your area, or if there aren't third physical spaces for any sort of organizing, this is going to impact everyone, but it's also going to impact Jewish communal organizing in that way. That touches a little bit on the question, the last question, or the second last question that I had about what the Jewish street is today. The fact is, especially in a lot of places like in America, this is a similar situation. Suburbs hurt communal organizing of all kinds. But for Jewish communities, I think it's particularly damaging, or at least disproportionate in that sense, because for a lot of people, what Jewish identity ends up being is driving, in America there's the reform movement as well, which changes things, like driving to synagogue, driving to be able to meet people in the Jewish school, and summer camp being such an important part of Jewish communal life, because it's a retreat from sort of interactions that people used to have on a daily basis as part of a community, except you have it for a few weeks in a rural retreat. So in terms of what does a Jewish street mean, I think that this needs to be an influence on livable cities, on easy public transport. Some Jews will inevitably concentrate to a significant extent if they want to live in an Orthodox Jewish environment. And you can see this, I think you can see this kind of vibrancy that is different between a place like Vienna, which has a very urbanized Jewish area, by no means like a ghetto in Belfortstadt, but in comparison to a lot of suburbs of London, which are very centered around cars and detached houses in very neat rows. Places like where my extended family lives, like big urban deserts, I would describe them to some extent. So yeah, I think that's these are the sort of general issues that impact everyone. The way in which our cities are designed are not set in stone. They are things that can be changed. They are things that should be changed, in my opinion. To a certain extent, it's going to be increasingly done, I think, because of climate change, because of the way in which these are designed and not coping with heat waves and such. In terms of the youth thing, I'm not sure if you know the work of Jewish Labour, right? So that's something that certainly would be helpful. I don't like this. I don't like the differentiation between youth and old. In some of the first organizing that I got involved with, I saw the kind of energy that old people who want to after retiring want to have a sense of the activity and the community, who are able to be in certain places where students or working people can't always be. Like if you need someone to go to a demonstration Wednesday 10 a.m. in the morning, that's kind of stuff. Also, bearing in mind that it looks much worse when police assaults 65-year-olds than a 20-year-old. So there are different pragmatic reasons, experience, even life experience. I think you need everyone. That's what I'm saying. I don't think there's sort of like saying that the youth brings forward. In some sort of sense of that young people will be around for longer at any given point, but I don't think that that's something that needs to be too much given an emphasis. As to this other pro-Palestine organizations, I will mention actually in terms of Café Bund. First of all, I mentioned Michal Klepfish, the fighter in the ghetto uprising, his daughter, who was part of the lesbian gay movement in the 70s. She visited us a few weeks ago in Prague, over here, and she gave us quite a few books to the library because she was on the tour of Poland. In Krakow, we do have connections with the different pro-Palestine movement. There's an encampment. They all throughout the summer, which is quite exhausting, I imagine. I think if you look at, especially in America, you now see a lot of people that, in the organizing efforts of the Bund, have connections to JVP. Some even local Bund organizations are being done in connection with JVP chapters or pods, which is what they call a PRIA chapter. What I would say is just that, and I know people who are involved in JVP personally in connections in America, but something that I think that JVP is not a diasporist organization in my view. In my view, organizations like JVP, and I'm counting this, I don't want to go through this. Let's focus on America, they're far away, they can't get us. But I think JVP and some people in the way in which JVP operates, they have sometimes very clearly the potential towards slipping into what I like to call reverse Zionism, which is where Israel is the central part of your identity and you really hate it. And that's like your Jewishness, right? Your Jewishness is like there are people who are like, we even met one I met one person in Austria like this. It's like their reason for existence, like the organization, is so that they can come to the pro-Palestine demonstration and say that they're not, like, be the people that make it so that they're not considered anti-Semitic, right? Which I think this is a very surface level sort of connection towards Jewish organizing. I'm not saying that all of JVP is like this, or even the majority of JVP. I think, especially, the situation is different in America because America is by far the largest weapons supplier to the Israeli government, and America is has the veto power of the Security Council and giving a blank check to the Netanyahu government. So the situation there is slightly different. I think what needs to be considered, this is what my perspective is. I was for 3 years at university in Britain. I was part of the Palestine Society at my university. I was elected vice president. I was regularly present at the encampment at my last university. I think what needs to be said is that these spaces, like pro-Palestine spaces, they need to exist. They need to exist whether or not there's a ceasefire, whether or not that's going to happen. But there needs to be more work done in the way in which there's structured, in terms of like a lot of the limitations that cause them to be weaker and that make it much more difficult for the actual good work to be done for Palestinians. I'm talking about things like very much having a negative vision, like being opposed. It's very like, if you look at a lot of Palestine solidarity spaces, what you see is anti-Israel, anti-Zionism, anti-apartheid, anti-genocide, anti-war, anti, right? And then there's the things about like structures, a lot of, and lack of welfare procedures. If someone says something that is considered problematic or anti-Semitic or racist of any kind, it's difficult to sort of have a movement that is able to hold that person accountable if you don't have structures, if you don't have welfare procedures, if you don't have any sort of like membership. So it's like these are the things that I think you can engage with the Palestine solidarity movement. I think that the worst thing that you can possibly do is to not engage with a political position because of the people that espouse that political position, right? Even if the people in your movement like are, you can say like the Palestine solidarity movement in my town is anti-Semitic, like that says more about the local people itself than the actual principles on the ground, and you can engage with it in a constructive, a critical way when necessary, active in it when necessary, and now I think it certainly is, and also work towards it in a partnership capability. There's a writer, Emma Dabbery, a Black Irish writer, who wrote this book, What White People Can Do Next during the Black Lives Matter protests in 2020. And she differentiates there very nicely the difference between allyship and coalition. And one of this sort of ties into a quote that was made by an Indigenous Australian activist, which I always butcher. And it's basically, if you have come to help me, and to say that, then you are wasting my time. But if you say that your struggle is combined with mine, then let us work together, right? There are important ways in which Jews and Palestinians and everyone can be coalition partners, whether it is here, whether it is there, whether it is everywhere, and only through working together on an equal basis like that can we hope for a better world. And that is